All right, so I have to start off, I think, with a few apologies. So the first apology is, unlike our last set of excellent speakers, I can't really offer you guys any, fantastic practical advice about how to get a job or offer you a job. So that's my first apology. I'm sorry. And my second apology is, I know it's been a very long day, and I'm one of the few things that is standing between you and cocktail hour. So I will try to make this as brief as possible so we get to Professor Katz and then the networking portion of the afternoon. So those are my apologies. I always like to get those out of the way. But I also want to say thank you. It kind of has blown my mind that this is a student-run conference. You guys put it together and did a fantastic job. I've learned so much today, so thank you. So we got the apologies, we got the thank yous out of the way, and now I guess there's nothing left for me to do except talk about the research a little bit. So today's been a very interesting day for me. I think it really shows the breadth and depth of what emerging media studies can look like. The range of topics that were covered, both in the poster session, the morning panels, and the afternoon session, was really pretty staggering. It's very rare that I get to go to a day's discussion where I get to learn more about the Bachelor and the Bachelorette, as one of the posters showed us. So it's great when my professional and my personal interests collide, as they did there. But also find really interesting, novel research that covers the world of art and curation, covers talking about communities that develop around particular health and disease issues, talk about the practical relevance of taking tools and applying them to the business world. So it's really fantastic. What it tells me is that emerging media studies is really a big tent, right? It can contain a diverse set of topics, a diverse set of researchers, and a diverse set of methodological approaches. And so what I'd like to do in my very short remarks today, and I promise, because I see the wine bottles, it'll be very short, is I want to tug that tent just a little bit further in two directions, and encourage you as students and scholars of emerging media studies to think about how you might think about, and I'm going to whisper it, old media, and integrating some sort of backwards-looking historical research, as well as taking a topic that is near and dear to my heart, as was mentioned in the introduction, and think about security. Because I think that the tools that you've developed, the insights that you've shown, and sort of the analytic posture that emerging media studies shows, suggests that these areas, looking backwards, understanding how old media continues to morph despite its name and change over time, as well as thinking about some of what I think are the most pressing issues of today, which are how security is interacting with and shaping the digital tools we all use day in and day out. I think there's some real contributions that can be made there. So even though we have a big tent, I'm going to try to stretch it out a little bit further. Okay, so the concept of emergence, I think, is really rich and it's really useful. It's more than just studying novelty, which is new technologies that are sort of on the cutting edge, though it's certainly that. It's also thinking about a particular analytic posture. And to me, what that posture highlights, and this is what I think that most of us in this room might have in common, is the ways in which institutions, organizations, users, individuals, and a range of other forces all work together to shape and define how a particular technology and set of media practices are constructed. So in other words, what we're highlighting here is how emergence allows us to focus on how certain technologies are always going to be defined as having legitimate uses, legitimate users, and sets of users and uses that are out of bounds, discouraged, not prioritized. It lets us see how a broad range of affordances, thinking about the theme of the conference today, are linked with the technology and how those affordances or opportunities become winnowed down over time, how they become whittled away into a set of predictable set of users and uses. And to think about and reflect on, well, what are the implications of those sort of lost opportunities? So emergence isn't just about the birth of new technologies necessarily, it's about the birth of new practices. It's about how seeing something that was stable and fixed can become open. But it's also about tracing things in the other direction, seeing how technologies that are once open and available for all different sorts of uses become fixed over time. So I think this stakes a fairly broad claim for all of us in this room to think about emerging media studies in different ways. And it's not just about novel technologies, though of course it's that. It's also somewhat about thinking about media practices themselves. Even old media practices can change over time. Okay, so that insight isn't mine. It comes from Susan Lee Starr. Lee Starr was a very well-known communication scholar and sociologist of infrastructure. And Lee's point, and the question she often posed, was that when we think about infrastructures, the question you should often ask is a large technological system, and it applies for media as well, is when is it finished? And more importantly, how would you ever know? So what Lee is really saying here is that technologies themselves are always in a status or a state of emerging. They're always, at some level, open to being renegotiated and redefined. And what she asked us to do in our scholarship was to study the ways in which those sorts of openings became possible and then later would become locked down or foreclosed. So this is a fairly long wind-up to say, leading into what I think are the two ways in which we can open that tent a little bit further. One, looking backwards historically, the other looking towards a topic that hasn't been covered today, but I think is really important, where my area of expertise lies: security. Expertise in quotes, of course. So in terms of looking back, I want to look way back, like 19th century back, and talk a little bit about the postal system. Now, how many of you thought today when you signed up to come to this conference that you would hear someone talk about the postal system? No hands, which means you guys are all telling the truth. Oh, I don't believe it for a second. Okay. Now I want to use that as an example of showing you how even old media continually emerges and reemerges, and suggest how a scholar of emerging media studies might take and adopt a historical backwards look. Now, if you're not interested in the postal system, don't worry, it'll be brief. The second topic I'll focus on is thinking about and giving some observations about a new project I started just recently at Northeastern, which is examining the ways in which new security interventions are shaping the ways in which we use digital technologies. Okay, so there's a long, rich tradition of studying the postal system in communication scholarship. Richard Kilbowitz, David Henkin, and others have offered useful contributions to thinking about the postal system as an important medium of communication. And what they study and what they remind us is that the postal system, like all media, particularly all old media, is that it's never really fixed. It goes into periods where the set of practices, the set of users, our expectations of it are somewhat set in place, but those expectations are continually upended. New users come into the system, the medium itself is redefined in a new sort of way, and an old medium is given new life. And so John and Kilbowitz, they focus on, and we'll walk through sort of three transitions. We see the post office moves from being a public medium to being an individual medium to finally being an ad-supported commercial medium. John and Kilbowitz are the ones who focus on that first moment, and they suggest that we see a radical transformation where an old medium is remade anew. Here they're talking about the early 1800s. And the transformations they identify are sort of threefold. They see that for the first time, the postal system becomes unmoored or unconnected to concerns about cost. It's almost like a program of universal service. Now, for the first time, postal service is extended out across the nation to every corner of the community. Next, the second change they note is that this massive commitment to growth is matched with a massive commitment to public information. So newspapers would travel free, public speeches would circulate at no cost. Information that had a public character was prioritized in favor. So these sorts of users and uses were prioritized above others. And third, the interesting thing that happened and why it was sort of different from the old media of the day, which would have been earlier forms of postal service, was that there was a strong commitment to privacy. Individual letters would not be tampered with. The content of the communications would not be surveilled. This was in stark contrast to how things that came before. So here we see in the early 19th century, essentially, we see some key decisions that transform an old medium into a new one. And it is radically different. Here we get the first development of what I would call a public medium of communication, one that is devoted to the circulation of public information in ways that was really stunning. And observers at the time noticed it as such. But, as my comments earlier suggested, even old media have new lives. In the middle decades of the 19th century, we see something new. This public medium becomes an individual medium. I think there's lessons here for us when we think about contemporary technologies as well, seeing how things that look like they might be dead in the road, old, set in their ways, can be reinvigorated. In the middle decades of the 1800s, what we see is it becomes an individual medium. The post office department slashes rates, and for the first time, individuals, regular folks, start sending letters to one another. This is a massive economic, cultural, and social change. As David Henkin in The Postal Age, which is a fascinating study of this period, points out, individuals had to learn a new skill. And that new skill was, how do I write a letter to someone? What kind of content is expected? How do I engage in a romantic relationship via letters? So in other words, they had to find out what it meant to be engaged as an individual user with this new communication network. And the transformation was wholesale and significant. It upended sort of existing taboos about communication, and it created sort of new possibilities. So yet again, we see an old medium emerging again anew. And the last period of transformation, the one that I had studied back when I was in many of your positions as a graduate student, was examining what happened in the 1970s for the post office. And here we see a radical reconfiguration again of an old medium again becoming new. And the transformation was, it became an ad-supported medium. It became a way in which you get delivered junk mail. Ads, for the first time, became the dominant form of communication sent through the mail. This isn't a good thing or a bad thing necessarily, but it's a different thing. It brought different users into the system. It transformed how postal rates were designed and set. And most importantly, it changed how people thought of the medium of communication. Okay, that concludes my long sort of discussion of the post office. So for all of you who are sort of biding your time, it's over. But I think there are important lessons here for us. And it's the idea that this big tent that is emerging media studies, it doesn't have to only be looking forward. It can look backwards as well. And when you look backwards, what you might find is you might find old media also is emerging. It's emerging in new ways. It's constantly being remade. So I would encourage you to keep in mind Lee Starr's sort of invocation, which is that how would you know when media was finished? How would you know when it was complete? To recognize that in some ways it's always emerging. And that gives you all, everyone in this room, a leg up, because you have the tools to understand and focus on that dynamic sort of operation where users, technologies, regulations, organizations all can collide to shape how a new technology, or even an old technology, will be made anew. Okay. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the work I currently do. So I'm currently working on a project that has two unusual sponsors. It's sponsored by the Defense Department, and it's sponsored by Facebook. Now, as far as I know, these are not exactly the most common bedfellows. And if you follow sort of the news, you'll see oftentimes, folks at Facebook are at odds with, over spying and things like that. Yet, they found something they can agree on, which is funding me and my colleagues. So for that, thank you. And what we're looking at here are questions about digital security. I think that this contemporary moment, there's a variety of conversations around security that are worth exploring. So for example, how many of you have been following the debate between Apple and the FBI about access to the phone of the San Bernardino terrorists? Okay, many hands. Right, and that debate is about many things, but one thing it's about is, should Apple have to circumvent its own security in order to give lawful access to a phone? In this case, a phone of someone who's already deceased. It raises interesting questions about the obligations of a company to comply with particular orders, but it also allows us to see that questions about digital security are very much still being debated in terms of both technological architecture and policy and legal provisions. Another topic, and one that we're going to circle back to, relates to vulnerability disclosure. There's ongoing debates at the highest levels of the government and industry about what happens when we find a new software bug. Is there an obligation of a researcher to turn it over? Can they sell it? Should the government be collecting them? And if they are collecting them, what can and can they not do with them? We see debates going on about data localization, sometimes referred to as data sovereignty. Countries like Germany, Indonesia, Brazil, and others have enacted policies and laws that require particular architectural changes in how cloud storage operates. Now, some folks see these as ways of boosting up domestic industry, which they are, but there are also security interventions that are designed to keep essentially foreign snoops out of domestic networks. We also see, of course, a large-scale conversation about encryption. So how many of you have been following the encryption debate? Okay, a few hands. How many of you know what WhatsApp is? How many of you received a notice probably 2 or 3 months ago saying, now your WhatsApp conversations are encrypted end-to-end? Okay, so for those of you who had your hand up, what do you think that meant? And how did it make you feel? I'm referring to the woman in the red dress who is now hiding from my comments. I would say your name, but my eyes, even my glasses, aren't that good. So when you saw that pop up, what did you think?
Well, it seemed like WhatsApp is saying that your messages are now secure.
Yeah, okay. Your messages are now secure. Most of us probably didn't give it a second thought, but this was an enormous sort of move. 1 billion people received new forms of security, essentially like that, overnight. Now for folks in the law enforcement community, for folks who are in the intelligence community, this was, if not a disaster, part of an ongoing trend that they're incredibly worried about. So although it gave you, and I'm sorry ma'am, I don't know your name, although it gave you greater security, for folks in the law enforcement community and intelligence community, they saw it as a way of essentially circumventing and blocking lawful collection, investigation, and essentially intelligence gathering. So for them, the strong encryption that a company like WhatsApp rolled out for 1 billion customers overnight makes their job not just harder, almost impossible. Now, there's many more of these sort of debates and topics that are interesting and ongoing at the moment. They all hinge around the fulcrum of different notions of security. Some are about the security of data and devices. Some are about national security at a more abstract level. But they're all sort of going on about how are we going to use our devices? How are we going to use platforms and software services? Who are going to be defined as legitimate users? Who's going to be defined as having legitimate uses? And what's going to be considered as out of bounds? Essentially what we're going to see is these security debates in some ways are shaping, winnowing away the affordances that new technologies provide us in ways that we might be uncomfortable with or we might think are completely justified. So the project I'm currently working on focuses on what are known as 0 days. Does anyone know what a 0 day is? In the back?
It's an undiscovered kind of security vulnerability that was pre-existing in the software.
Very good, okay. And he's not a ringer, I didn't plant him, as we saw from the earlier panel. Yep, so a 0 day or an O day as it's sometimes known are previously unknown and undisclosed software vulnerabilities. They're flaws in Windows, Google Chrome, Firefox, browsers, applications that are currently not yet known to the vendor, yet they've been discovered by someone else. We call them 0 days or O days because the vendor has 0 days to create a patch for them. Now, these are really nasty bugs. The reason they're nasty bugs or flaws is because a worm or a virus or an otherwise malicious exploit that's built around one of these flaws can't really be stopped. Okay? Antivirus software, other defenses, they don't do a good job at handling attacks that target a 0 day. And what we've seen is that intelligence agencies, including our own National Security Agency, militaries, law enforcement communities, and criminals, all are in the market to buy up and use 0 days. In 2013, the NSA spent $25 million on purchasing these sorts of flaws for their own purposes. Now, what I'm studying is sort of a counter movement. It's the work by Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and over 100 different vendors to start for the first time paying for these flaws. What I'm studying is the market for 0 days or O days. And what we're trying to do is trace out the political economy for how bugs are bought and sold. Who's buying them? Who's selling them? What are the motivations? How are the transactions structured? And then looking at what I would think are the more important, larger sets of questions that come out of this study, come out of our sort of analysis of the political economy, which is what is the impact this market has on us? Does it create new risks of sort of proliferation, where are states buying these things to sort of up their intelligence gathering capabilities and their sort of offensive cyber operations? The tentative answer appears to be yes. Does the purchase of 0 days provide law enforcement communities with a useful set of tools to collect evidence? Yes, this is essentially how the FBI got into the San Bernardino iPhone, right? They bought an undisclosed flaw, they used it, they're not going to disclose it to Apple. The question there is, well, was it worth it? Does it scale? What are the implications of having a government, our government or others, purchasing these flaws and not disclosing them? Another set of questions we're interested in is, does commodification lead to greater discovery and patching? So in other words, does having a market run by Google and Microsoft and Facebook actually improve security? Or does it actually just churn up a lot of trivial bugs that otherwise we don't really care about? That's very much an open question. And finally, what we're really interested in is, what are the norms that govern discovery? Who's doing the discovery and how do they make a decision where to sell? And so the data we've collected provisionally includes data from over 101 programs, some of which is anonymized. The Facebook data we have, which involves over $4 million in sales, several hundred different sellers, is anonymized. And we have publicly available open data sets from HackerOne, which is an online platform that coordinates sort of these markets. And that involves over 100 different vendors. And there we have several $1 million of transactions and several thousand different sellers, or bug hunters, however you want to call them, operating. And we're just starting to try to make sense of this data in a new way. And as I've been working through it, and as I was thinking about my remarks today, it struck me this is a perfect sort of challenge and problem for folks in emerging media studies. It's asking us to think about how are users, in this case folks who find vulnerabilities, interacting with these platforms. How is sort of their decisions being governed by not only the logic of the technology, but decisions made by corporations, by policymakers, and by the law. And what I really understood is that some of the techniques that I saw both in the poster session and earlier today, of sort of working with large-scale data sets or medium-range data sets, making sense of them, could certainly be applied here. So I was very much inspired as I'm starting out on this new project to think about some of the things that all of you are talking about and applying. So I promised I'd be brief, and I'm going to keep that promise. So in summation, what I would like to say is what I took away from this conference today was incredibly encouraging. Emerging media studies is a big field. It's a big tent. It has room to accommodate folks who are interested in weird things like the post office, as well as folks who are interested in really important things like the Bachelor and the Bachelorette, which I'm not joking is really important. I could not agree more. But the point here is there is something common that I think unites us, and it's that interest in understanding how users, organizations, and others help shape and decide which set of affordances will be seized upon and which sort of aspects of a new technology will get ignored. And what I would encourage you guys to do is in that big tent, still keep a little room to think about, on the one hand, how is old technology, old media always emerging, right? It's never static. It might have a period of fixity, but that period of fixity is really temporary. And also, look at the security questions. For someone who is looking or fishing or thinking about where they take their amazing analytic skills that you've all developed, questions around security are rich, they're interesting, they are complex, and they can be incredibly rewarding, and most importantly, they're really important. So that's my sort of plea to make sure this tent gets stretched just a little bit further, and with that, I will conclude. Thank you. Oh, and I guess we'll take questions.
Sure, yeah.
Sorry.
We've got
If you guys have any questions, I'm more than happy to field them. And they can be very general questions like, so what is a 0 day again? About the project. Yeah, in the back.
So
And maybe if you guys could say your names, I feel like most people here know each other, but I'm sort of the outsider, so maybe just like a very brief introduction if you don't mind.
I'm Jacob. I'm a student in the EMS program. So what I thought was really interesting about the Apple case is that Apple refused to give out the rights or the technology to hack the phone or to find a flaw to get into the phone. They only had access themselves. But at the same time, they demanded that if the FBI were to find a loophole in or a zero-day flaw, and which they did, that they should be aware of it so they can fix that. What do you think? Do you think that a company that is so strongly focused on security that has a flaw, do you think they should have the rights to demand, access to know the flaws? Do you think it should be played part of?
Jacob, is it? I think your intuition that Apple can't really have it both ways, which is one, you can't ask us to build a backdoor, but if you find a backdoor, you have to immediately disclose it to us. That seems probably like an untenable position. And I think, so Apple's general concern is if there's a flaw available to one person, FBI, let's say, it could be exploited by anyone. There's nothing that's going to prevent someone else from discovering it. So vulnerabilities are informational goods, they're non-rivalrous, and they're always open to rediscovery. So Apple will say, look, if we build a backdoor, anyone can access it potentially. And they would say essentially the same thing with whatever flaw or vulnerability the FBI has contracted out with a firm to discover. There's no telling someone else might find that and exploit it as well. So that's sort of their logic. But I think as a practical matter, Apple's left with two somewhat unappealing choices, which is re-architect their systems so that they can provide lawful access when the law enforcement demands it, which they do not want to do and will not do. Or you sort of live with the fact that law enforcement is going to rely on buying up flaws that already exist. I think in the short term and the long term, Apple much rather that second scenario because it removes them from any obligation to sort of do the extra engineering work. It allows them still to market their products as secure, which is very important, particularly abroad as well as the US. And the sort of use of 0 days for law enforcement, because they're expensive, so buying a 0 day can cost 6 figures. It ensures that access will be used sparingly. It doesn't really scale. So for law enforcement, the reason they don't like this approach is they can't keep buying 0 days every time they want to unlock a drug dealer's phone in, pick your city of choice. They can kind of only pick and choose their spots, and it makes them much more targeted in how they conduct searches, which is a good thing from Apple's point of view, and probably a bad thing from the government's point of view. So there's a real contradiction there. I think Apple will live with sort of turning a blind eye to the government buying these 0 days and using them if they have to, if that's a choice. Yep.
I don't know if you've been following the recent news story about Democratic National Convention. But it seems like the cybersecurity experts were deliver this very certain pronouncement that it was these Russian groups, two independent Russian groups doing it, and we know this for sure. Can you speak a little bit to how they can be so certain that is, that a credible application is that, especially with private individuals now coming forward and saying, no, it was me, you're all wrong?
Yeah, so a little background on the hack is that the opposition research and other files were apparently exfiltrated from the DNC in the campaigns. Also, nested in that story, I would assume that all the major campaigns were hacked. Why would they be hacked? Well, they have interesting information. People want to know what the transition might look like, who's going to be moving in key places, and get ahead of whatever policy pronouncements might be coming. We certainly do the same things, and I think everyone thinks it's more or less fair game, but unfortunate and not a good thing. Right? These are like legitimate political targets. But the more interesting question is, well, how do we know the Russians did it? How do we know so fast? Well, at some level, we always say the Russians did it, or the Chinese did it. And so, and no one rarely argues and says, no, no, they don't do that sort of thing, because they do, and we do too, and okay. But there have been real advances made in how we conduct attribution. For years, the thought was a range of traditional law enforcement responses to sort of cyber crime or state-sponsored cyber attacks were hampered because we couldn't do attribution. It looks like that's not exactly true anymore. We've gotten a lot more confident with good reason in doing attribution. So after the North Korea hack of Sony, very quickly, a few days, FBI came out and said, it's North Korea. Now the problem, both we're seeing with the DNC case and with the North Korea case, is it's very rare that we can actually disclose how we did the attribution. So you have this odd situation where you have a public official stand up and say, we know who did it, it's these guys, I can't tell you how we know. And the point here is, although we can do technical attribution, what we can't do is public attribution, which requires us to disclose information with confidence. Because the sources and methods we use to do these sorts of things are classified, they're sensitive, and if they were disclosed, we would lose our access to knowing what sort of things are going on in North Korea, for example. So the real challenge, as I see it around attribution, isn't the timeliness of attribution anymore, necessarily. It's not getting it right, because I think we do get it right now most of the time. It's finding a way to create a set of institutions where we can do it with confidence in a public forum so people believe it and can act on it. That sort of challenge of public attribution, not technical attribution, that's the real ongoing challenge, and you certainly see that in this case. And without being able to do it in a credible way in a public forum, it does allow people to say, no, no, it wasn't me, or someone else to stand up and say, it was me, and take credit for it, because we can't disclose that additional information, that additional layer of information that you would need to make public to say with certainty, yes, it was, name your bad guy. So it's interesting. Yet again, another topic that I think media scholars, not just political scientists, for good Lord, don't cede the floor just to the political scientists. Media scholars here certainly can offer a useful contribution. Yep.
So let's pretend it's a world where developers actually submit final products.
Okay.
I mean, that's probably never going to happen, but they actually ship out, whether it's a website, app, browser, etc., that isn't shipped with a flaw. So at day zero, maybe they're getting more protective over the potential day zero things.
Okay.
What would a company like yours do to move forward and innovate to actually, still stick around if these companies are being smarter?
I think the general theory is, so as part of the lead up to this project, we spoke with people at Microsoft, Facebook, Google, and a variety of other places. Some who I think do security well, some who do security less well. Like Google Chrome is really good. So I don't know what browsers you guys are using, have your machines open, but you should be using Chrome. It's really good. There's other good ones out there. And what Chrome has done well is they know there's going to be flaws. It's inevitable. So even a company that has the best engineers of the world, even a company that is using open source, really good, intelligent folks to create secure products, they're going to get it wrong. They always get it wrong because code is complex and there's always going to be failings. But what they do well with Chrome and other devices, that people who are sort of doing a really good job of security, it's not that they try to make flawless software. It's that they make iteration fairly quick. They make their failures transparent, and they learn from them really, really fast. And so the question isn't how do we make products that are completely secure, there's no attack surface. It's how do we make sure that the insecurities bubble to the top as fast as we can, and most importantly, we can roll out patches in a quick way to fix them. That's really what the Apple case was about. Apple wants to be able to, and they are, able to roll out patches to your iPhone without you really doing much. It updates in the background all the time. What they're worried about is if they have to use that sort of update mechanism to deliver a virus for the FBI, people are going to stop auto-updating their phones, and for them, that's a disaster. So the key, to take your point, is not to try to make perfect software, it's try to make imperfect software fix as fast as we can, and the failure is transparent. Does that make sense?
Yep.
One more question? Yep.
I guess going off of that.
I lied when I said I'd be brief.
The importance of iteration and being able to patch exploits as soon as they become available. To what extent does that create a balancing act with user sovereignty or user agency, where people, not everyone is comfortable with auto updates for various reasons. And I know recently Microsoft basically tried to low-key force a lot of people to update to Windows 10, and they got a lot of pushback on it, even though that almost objectively makes your computer more secure. So how do companies, I guess, deal with that almost public communication issue of security, of you need to trust us to do these things without having to authorize it every single time?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. So the best thing you can do is enable auto updates and install your updates regularly. But if there's no trust, as you accurately point out, why would you do that? So how does a company or a vendor ensure that its users are confident enough in what they're doing to know that the new install isn't going to create more problems, it's not going to crash, it's not going to become backwardsly incompatible with whatever else I currently had installed? And I think the way you do that is simply through time, right? And reputation. The sort of core, as I think someone in the earlier panel said, just because we're dealing with the train of new media, the lessons from the previous set of media, old media still apply. And here that lesson is build trust with your users, and then for goodness sakes, don't abuse that trust. So don't install an update like Windows 10 that might require someone to now purchase a whole set of new services that weren't compatible. Because people are going to feel like they got cheated, and they're not going to install the update. Make sure the updates are reasonably secure. So you're not updating, Java every 5 minutes. So doing these sorts of things, which are just good corporate and communication practices, I think goes a long way to actually making us more secure. So you found connections that I didn't even see, which was really helpful for tying a little bow on this discussion. So thank you guys for the questions. I think that's it. And if you guys have any other comments, happy to chat afterwards. And thank you so much for having me. I learned a lot today. Thanks.